I have the right to inspect your grandfather's cabin whether you like it or not." This crazy woman screamed right into my face through a door I hadn't even opened yet. She claimed to be the HOA president of our community. The problem was we lived in the middle of the woods and there wasn't an HOA within dozens of miles of us. But this Karen didn't care. She held up a stack of very official-looking papers, a clipboard, and had the eyes of someone who truly believed she had the right to control the entire area. She thought all it took was a stack of papers and a threatening tone. But what she didn't know was that when my grandfather opened that door, what she'd see first wouldn't be compliance papers. And when that clicking sound rang out, that's when this whole story took a turn. Trust me, you'll want to keep watching to see how Karen ended up. Please comment and tell Harper Stories family about the craziest HOA story you've ever encountered. My name is Jake Morrison, and 3 months ago, I thought moving to my grandfather's cabin in the Colorado wilderness would be the perfect escape from city drama. As a 25-year-old software engineer who'd gone fully remote after the pandemic, I figured I could code in peace, surrounded by pine trees instead of honking traffic and demanding clients. The cabin sat on 40 acres of pristine forest land that my grandfather William had inherited from his father, making it legitimately ours for over 60 years with a clear title and zero complications. No homeowners associations, no neighborhood, no Karen types telling me what color I could paint my mailbox or whether my grass was exactly 2 inches tall. The property deed was crystal clear about our boundaries and rights, and I'd checked with the county office twice just to be absolutely certain. This was supposed to be my sanctuary, my place to build the kind of life where the biggest decision I had to make was whether to have my morning coffee on the front porch or the back deck while watching deer graze in the meadow beyond the tree line. The cabin itself was a beautiful 2-story log structure with Araparan porch that my great-grandfather had built with his own hands back in 1962, complete with that classic American flag hanging from the front post that had been there since my childhood visits. It represented everything I loved about this country: simple values, hard work, and the freedom to live your life without somebody breathing down your neck every 5 minutes about regulations and compliance and community standards. The flag wasn't fancy or expensive, just a standard 3x5 American flag that flew proudly in the mountain breeze, faded slightly from years of Colorado weather, but still beautiful in its simplicity. My grandfather had always told me that the flag represented the freedom his father fought for in World War II, and seeing it wave in the morning sunlight always reminded me why I loved this place so much. It was a symbol of independence, of the right to live your life on your terms, which was exactly what I thought I was doing by moving out here to the middle of nowhere. That Tuesday morning in late September started like any other peaceful day in paradise. I was deep in code debugging a particularly stubborn authentication system for a client's e-commerce platform, while my coffee grew cold beside my laptop on the kitchen table. The forest was quiet except for the occasional bird call and the distant sound of wind through the pines, creating the kind of natural white noise that helped me focus on complex programming problems. I'd been up since 5 a.m. working on this project, trying to take advantage of the early morning hours when my brain was sharpest and the internet connection was most reliable. Then, at exactly 700 a.m., someone started pounding on my front door, like they were trying to break it down with their bare fists, not knocking politely, not ringing a doorbell, but full-on aggressive pounding that immediately triggered my fight-or-flight response, and made me wonder if there was some kind of emergency happening. The sound echoed through the cabin like gunshots, startling me so badly that I nearly spilled coffee all over my laptop and lost an hour's worth of unsaved code. I quickly saved my work, grabbed my coffee mug, more out of habit than necessity, and walked to the front door, expecting to find a lost hiker who'd gotten turned around on the trail system, or maybe a park ranger with some kind of urgent notice about a forest fire or dangerous wildlife in the area. What I found instead was a woman in her early 50s wearing a black business suit that looked completely ridiculous in the middle of the wilderness, like she'd gotten dressed for a corporate board meeting and then somehow ended up 40 mi from the nearest city. She was holding a leather clipboard like it was some kind of weapon or badge of authority and sporting the kind of haircut that screamed, "I demand to speak to your manager," from 3 counties away. Her makeup was perfect despite the early hour, and the fact that she'd driven up a dirt road to get here, which immediately made me suspicious about how often she made these kinds of visits and how well rehearsed her whole routine was. "Good morning," I said, opening the door halfway and keeping my hand on the frame because something about her aggressive gesture made me reluctant to give her full access to my space. "Can I help you with something?" She didn't respond to me greeting with any pleasantries or even basic human courtesy. Instead, she immediately launched into what sounded like a carefully rehearsed speech delivered with the kind of artificial authority that comes from years of bullying people into submission through bureaucratic intimidation. "I'm Karen Blackwood, president of the Pine Valley Homeowners Association, and I'm here to conduct a mandatory inspection of this property for compliance violations," she announced like she was reading from a script. She held up her clipboard and gestured toward my cabin like she was doing me some kind of tremendous favor by gracing me with her presence. We've received multiple complaints about aesthetic violations on this property, and according to HOA Regulations Section 4.2.7, all residents must submit to quarterly compliance inspections to ensure community standards are maintained. The way she delivered this proclamation made it sound like I should be grateful she was taking time out of her busy schedule to help me understand how badly I was failing as a community member, and the confidence in her voice suggested she'd done this exact routine many times before with great success. Her tone was a perfect combination of condescending and threatening, like a school principal explaining to a troublemaker why they were about to be suspended. Except I was a grown man standing in the doorway of property my family had owned since before she was born. I stood there for a moment processing what I just heard because none of it made any sense. This woman was claiming authority over property that was literally in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by national forest land with no neighbors, 4 miles in any direction. "I'm sorry, but there must be some mistake," I said, trying to keep my voice polite, even though alarm bells were going off in my head, and I was starting to feel like it somehow wandered into an episode of some bizarre reality show. "This property isn't part of any homeowners association," I continued, gesturing toward the surrounding forest where you couldn't see another structure from LSC in any direction. "My family has owned this land for over 60 years, and we're not subject to any HOA regulations. I'm pretty sure we're the only occupied property within a 10 miles radius of here." Karen's expression didn't change one bit, like she'd heard this exact objection before and had her response ready to deploy. Her face remained completely neutral, professional, like she was dealing with a child who didn't understand how the adult world worked. "Sir, I don't care how long your family thinks they've owned this property," she said with the kind of condescending tone usually reserved for explaining simple concepts to particularly slow students. "The Pine Valley HOA was established in 2019 and encompasses all residential properties within our designated boundaries, regardless of when they were built or purchased. Ignorance of HOA regulations is not an excuse for non-compliance," and continued, "Violations will result in significant financial penalties." She flipped through several pages on her clipboard with theatrical precision, like she was consulting some sacred text that contained all the answers to life's mysteries and proper title disputes. Every movement was calculated and professional, from the way she held her pen to the angle at which she tilted her head while reviewing her papers. "According to our records, this property is currently in violation of multiple aesthetic standards," she continued, pointing at various parts of my cabin like she was identifying evidence at a crime scene. "Most notably, that flag hanging from your front porch is not in compliance with our approved color schemes and materials guidelines." I followed her gaze to the American flag that had been hanging there since before I was born, the simple red, white, and blue flag that my great-grandfather had put up to honor his service in World War II and that had weathered decades of Colorado seasons while representing everything your family valued about this country. The idea that someone could look at that flag and see a violation rather than a symbol of patriotism and family heritage was so absurd that I almost started laughing. "You're telling me that my American flag violates your HOA regulations?" I asked, not bothering to hide my disbelief anymore. The whole situation was becoming more surreal by the minute, like I'd somehow stepped into an alternate reality where basic patriotism was considered a neighborhood nuisance. "That's exactly what I'm telling you," Karen replied without missing a beat, her voice carrying the kind of certainty that comes from years of never being challenged. "Our community standards require all decorative elements to maintain a cohesive aesthetic vision, and that includes flags, banners, and other textile displays. The approved flag options are listed in Section 4.2.7 of our community guidelines, which you would know if you'd bothered to attend any of our monthly meetings." She said this like missing fictional HOA meetings was some kind of moral failing on my part, completely ignoring the fact that I'd never received any notifications about such meetings because they didn't exist. The license plate on Karen's black SUV wasn't from Colorado, it was from Montana. This detail hit me like a lightning bolt as I watched her stalk back to her vehicle after delivering her ultimatum about flag compliance and community standards. Why would a homeowners association president from a Colorado community be driving a carriage stood in Montana? And more importantly, why would someone from Montana care enough about a cabin in the Colorado wilderness to drive what had to be hundreds of miles just to complain about an American flag? As her sub disappeared down my driveway in a cloud of dust and righteous indignation, I couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was about much more than aesthetic violations. Something about Karen's entire presentation felt professional and completely wrong, like she'd done this exact routine many times before in many different places. I spent the next 2 hours researching everything I could find about the Pine Valley Homeowners Association, using every search engine and public records database I could access. The results were exactly what he'd expected, which was nothing. No official incorporation documents, no board meeting minutes, no community lists, no approved contractor lists, and no Section 4.272.7 of boot flag regulations. The Pine Valley HOA simply didn't exist in any legal or official capacity, at least not in Colorado. I called the county office to double-check my findings, and the clerk confirmed what I already said. Sir, there are no homeowners associations registered in that area, she told me, with the kind of patience reserved for dealing with confused residents. That entire region is unincorporated land with individual property owners, and there are no community oversight organizations operate under county authority. My next step was to drive over to Mrs. Chen's place, the only neighbor within reasonable distance of my cabin. Mrs. Chen was a 70-year-old widow who'd moved to the area 5 years ago to escape, sit at life and enjoy her retirement in peace. She lived in a small but beautiful house about 2 miles down the mountain road, complete with an elaborate vegetable garden that was her pride and joy. When I knocked on her door that afternoon, she greeted me with the kind of warm smile that immediately made me feel better about the morning's bizarre encounter. "Jake, what a nice surprise," she said, inviting me in for tea like she always did. "I was just thinking about bringing you some tomatoes from the garden. They're the best crop I've had in years." But when I mentioned Karen Blackwood in the Pine Valley, HOA, Mrs. Chen's expression changed completely and I watched her face go from cheerful to worried in about 2 seconds. "Oh my goodness, she came to see you too?" Mrs. Chen asked, her voice dropping to almost a whisper like she was afraid Karen might be listening from outside. "That woman showed up at my house last week with all sorts of official-looking papers, claiming I owed $2,000 in fines for violating community garden reg. She led me to her kitchen table where she pulled out a manila folder filled with documents that looked exactly like the ones Karen had been waving around at my cabin. According to her, my tomato plants were the wrong color and my garden layout didn't comply with HOA aesthetic standards," she said. "My vegetables were creating a visual disturbance that was negatively impacting property values in their community." The absurdity of someone complaining about the color of tomato plants would have been funny if Mrs. Chen didn't look so genuinely distressed about the whole situation. She was very convincing. Mrs. Chen continued, spreading the fake documents across her kitchen table so I could examine them. Professional letterhead, official language, specific regulation numbers. Everything looked completely legitimate. She even had a laminated badge that identified her as an HOA enforcement officer. I studied the papers carefully, noting the high-quality printing and attention to detail that had gone into creating these forgeries. Someone had invested serious time and money into making these documents look authentic, complete with legal-sounding language about compliance deadlines and escalating penalty structures. "Did you pay her anything?" I asked. Though I was afraid I already knew the answer based on Mrs. Chen's embarrassed expression, I gave her $500 as a good-faith payment. She admitted reluctantly. She said it would stop the fines from accumulating, while I worked on bringing my garden into compliance with community standards. Mrs. Chen showed me the receipt Karen had given her, which looked just as professional as everything else in her fake HOA arsenal. She told me there were at least a dozen of their properties in the area that had similar violations and that the HOA was cracking down on non-compliance because of complaints from concerned community members. Mrs. Chen explained. She made it sound like I was being irresponsible and selfish by not maintaining proper standards. The more I learned about Karen's operation, the angrier I became. This wasn't just some crazy woman with delusions of authority. This was a calculated scam targeting vulnerable who trusted official-looking documents and professional presentations. Mrs. Chen was exactly the kind of victim Karen was looking for. Someone living alone who wouldn't know how to vet legitimacy of HOA claims and who would be intimidated by threats of legal action. As I drove back to my cabin that evening, my mind was racing with questions about how many other people Karen had victimized and how long she'd been running this elaborate scam. The Montana license plate suddenly made perfect sense. She was from Stato State, targeting rural properties where residents wouldn't be familiar with local HOA regulations and wouldn't have easy access to verification resources. The professional quality of her fake documents suggested this wasn't her first rodeo, and the confidence with which she delivered her threats indicated she'd perfected her routine through lots of practice. When I got home, I immediately started researching some more scams in other states, looking for any reports of fake HOA enforcement in rural communities. What I found was even more disturbing than I'd expected, and it confirmed my worst suspicions about Karen Blackwood and her traveling violation circus. Karen didn't just know my name, she knew where I worked, she knew my bank account information, and she even knew my mother's address in Denver. This wasn't just some simple scam anymore. This was something much more sophisticated and potentially dangerous. The phone call came at 11 p.m. on a Thursday. Just as I was shutting down my laptop after a long day of coding, the number was blocked, but somehow I knew it would be Karen before I even answered. "Jake Morrison." Her voice came through the speaker with a kind of cold confidence that made my blood run cold. "I know you've been asking questions about me, and I know you've been talking to your neighbors about our previous conversations. That was a very foolish mistake on your part." The way she said it made it clear that she'd been monitoring my activities, somehow, which was both impressive and terrifying in equal measure. "I want you to understand something very clearly. Karen continued, her tone shifting from cold to openly threatening. I have resources at my disposal that you can't even imagine, and I have legal authority that extends far beyond your little mountain hideaway. If you continue to interfere with my official duties as HOA president, you're going to face consequences that will follow you for the rest of your life. She paused for effect, letting few of her words sink in before delivering what felt like a carefully rehearsed closing argument. I'm giving you one final opportunity to resolve this situation quietly and professionally. You can pay the outstanding fines for your property violations, remove that offensive flag from your porch, and we can all move forward like civilized adults. Or you can continue down this path of resistance and discover exactly how much one stubborn programmer can get himself into when he decides to challenge legitimate authority. The next morning, I found an official-looking envelope taped to my front door with my full name and address printed in professional block letters. Inside was a formal notice of legal action complete with case numbers, court dates, and a list of charges that included obstruction of official duties, harassment of community officials, and something called willful violation of established housing codes. The letterhead looked completely legitimate, with state seals and legal terminology that would have convinced me if I hadn't already known this was all fake. But what really got my attention was how much personal information Karen had managed to gather about me. The document included my social security number, my employer's contact information, my mother's address, and even details about me student loans that I'd never shared with anyone outside of financial institutions. Later that day, my boss called me with questions about legal issues that might affect my employment status. Someone claiming to be from a Colorado County Attorney's office had contacted the company to inquire about my pending legal troubles and whether they might impact my ability to maintain security clearances for our government contracts. Jake, I need to know what's going on, my boss said, his voice carrying the kind of concern that comes from dealing with HR departments and corporate liability issues. We can't have employees with active legal problems working on sensitive projects. And we definitely can't have people who are involved in harassment cases against local officials. I tried to explain that this was all part of an elaborate scam, but I could hear the skepticism in his voice as he listened to my story about fake HOA enforcement and traveling con artists. By the end of the week, I was starting to question my judgment about the entire situation. Karen's documentation looked so professional, her knowledge of legal procedures seemed so comprehensive, and her ability to gather personal information was so thorough that I began wondering if maybe I'd missed something important about HOA regulations in my area. Maybe there was some kind of regional housing authority that I'd never heard of. Or maybe there were county ordinances that applied to me, property that I hadn't researched properly. My cousin Tommy, who worked as a plumber in the area and had always been my go-to guy for practical advice about local issues, wasn't helping matters when he stopped by for his weekly visit. Jake, buddy, maybe you should just pay the lady and move on with your life, Tommy said while we sat in my porch drinking beer and watching the sunset. I mean, $500 isn't worth all this stress and drama, especially if it's affecting your job situation. Sometimes you've got to pick your battles, you know. Tommy had always been the voice of practical reason in our family. The guy who fixed problems with duct tape and common sense rather than overthinking every detail. She's got all these official papers. She knows way too much about your business, and she's connected to people who can make your life difficult. Maybe she does have some kind of authority that you didn't understand. The more he talked, the more I started to wonder if fighting Karen was worth the potential consequence to my career and my peace of mind. That Saturday night, I was seriously considering calling Karen to negotiate some kind of settlement when I heard a familiar truck engine coming up my driveway. My grandfather's old Ford pickup pulled into view, and I saw the man himself climbing out of the driver's seat with the kind of easy confidence head that comes from 75 years of dealing with life's challenges. William Morrison was supposed to be in Alaska, on his annual fishing trip with his old detective buddies. But here he was 3 weeks early and looking like he had something important on his mind. "Evening, Jake," he said with that slight smile. That always meant he knew more about a situation than he was letting on. "Heard you've been having some trouble with a lady named Karen Blackwood. Mind if we sit down and talk about that for a few minutes?" My grandfather's folder didn't just contain information about Karen. He filled a list of 47 other victims across 8 states, and all of them had been waiting for an opportunity to get there. As we sat at my kitchen table under the warm glow of the overhead light, Grandpa William spread out documents that looked like they belonged in a police evidence room rather than a fishing cabin. "Jake, I need you to understand something important," he said, his voice carrying the kind of gravity that comes from years of investigating serious crimes. "Karen Blackwood has been running this scam for almost 20 years, and she's gotten very good at it. Butch made one critical mistake when she decided to target our family property." He pulled out a thick manila folder labeled with Karen's name and what appeared to be case numbers from multiple jurisdictions. "I've been tracking this woman since 2009 when she destroyed an entire retirement community in Silver Creek, Montana." The Silver Creek case was what had originally put Karen on my grandfather's radar during his final years as a detective with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. 23 families lost their homes because of her fake HOA enforcement, Grandpa explained, his jaw tightening with old anger. 3 elderly residents died from stress-related heart attacks when they couldn't pay their escalating fines and faced foreclosure proceedings. I was part of the task force investigating financial crimes against seniors, but we could never get enough evidence to make charges stick. He showed me photographs of the Silver Creek community before and after Karen's operation, and the transformation was devastating. What hadn't been a thriving neighborhood of modest homes and well-maintained gardens had become a collection of foreclosed property and abandoned lots. The problem was that Karen was always one step ahead of us legally, Grandpa, pulling out copies of official documents that looked disturbingly similar to the ones she'd shown me. She had connections with corrupt county clerks who would create fake HOA registrations in their computer systems, making her authority appear legitimate when anyone tried to verify it. By the time we figured out the scope of her operation, she'd already moved on to the next state and the next group of victims. The files contained evidence of Karen's activities in Montana, Wyoming, Utah, Idaho, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, and now Colorado, with each location showing the same pattern of targeting rural properties and elderly residents who wouldn't know how to fight back against official-looking documentation. I spent the next 2 days making phone calls to the victims on Grandpa's list, and what I learned made me angrier than I'd ever been in my life. Maria Santos from outside Austin, Texas, had lost $5,000 to Karen's fake fence regulation violations before discovering the scam. She showed up with a county inspector who claimed my property line fence was 6 inches high and created a safety hazard for the community. Maria told me over the phone, her voice still bitter with the memory. I paid the fine because I was a single mother working 2 jobs and I couldn't afford to take time off work to fight it in court. It wasn't until 6 months later that I found that there was no HOA in my area and the inspector was just another one of her accomplices. Bob Thompson from a small town near Salt Lake City had a similar story about losing $3,000 for mailbox compliance violations. Shay had this whole presentation about federal postal regulations and community aesthetic standards, Bob explained during our phone conversation. She even brought someone who claimed to be from the Postal Service to verify that my mailbox was creating delivery hazards. I believed every word of it because Chas seemed so professional and knowledgeable about the regulations that Hendersons from Wyoming had lost their entire cabin because they couldn't afford to pay Karen's $15,000 fine for what she claimed were environmental violations related to their septic system. What made Karen's operation particularly insidious was her partnership with her ex-husband Richard Blackwood, a disbarred attorney who provided legal legitimacy to their scam. Richard would file actual court documents in jurisdictions where they had corrupted local officials. Grandpa explained as Ware viewed the evidence. The victims would receive real legal notices with valid case numbers, making it nearly for them to distinguish between legitimate legal action and elaborate fraud. The partnership had allowed them to operate across state lines while maintaining the appearance of legitimate legal authority. And they'd perfected their system over nearly 2 decades of victimizing vulnerable communities. Deputy Rodriguez, who had been my grandfather's partner during his final years on the force, agreed to meet with us at Thicabin to discuss our options for stopping Karen's current operation. The problem we've always had with this Cassie's jurisdictional complexity, he explained as we sat around my kitchen table reviewing the evidence. She operates across state lines, targets isolated communities where local law enforcement has limited resources, and she's always gone by the time victims realize they've been scammed. But Rodriguez was optimistic about our chances this time because Karen had made several crucial mistakes. She's been operating in our area for longer than usual. She's targeted too many residents. And most importantly, she doesn't know that William Morrison is still actively investigating her activities. We decided to reach out directly to Karen's other local victims rather than relying on social media or public forums that might tip her off to our investigation. Mrs. Chen agreed to host a private meeting at her house where we could gather testimonies and coordinate our response without alerting Karen to our activities. We need to be very careful about how we handle this, Grandpa warned as we planned our strategy. Karen has survived this long because she's smart, well-connected, and ruthless. When it comes to protecting her, if she realizes we're building a case against her, she'll disappear and start over somewhere else, leaving all her current victims without any hope of getting their money back. My name is Jason Miller, living in Chicago, and I'm the scriptwriter for the Harper Stories channel. This is the moment when the story officially shifts from a small dispute to a battle against an entire system. When the main character realizes the enemy isn't just a lone Karen Butin, an entire network of manipulators and power abusers. The story enters its second chapter. The fight is no longer personal but has become a responsibility to protect the community. From this point on, the audience doesn't just want the main character to win. They want justice to be served for all victims. That's when the personal tragedy of the grandfather and Jake becomes the driving force that turns the story into a community effort. 350 elderly residents, each about to be scammed out of $10,000 by Karen and Richard for fake HOA violations. That was $3.5 million. and the operation was scheduled to begin in 72 hours. Bob Thompson's hacking skills had uncovered emails detailing Karen's biggest score yet, a coordinated assault on the Golden Years community near Grand Junction that would dwarf everything she'd done before. "This isn't just another rural property scam," Bob explained over our secure video call, his face grim as Hesh at his screen with the rest of our impromptu task force. "They've spent 6 months infiltrating this retirement community, positioning Karen as a legitimate HOA consultant hired to help residents understand new federal housing regulations." The scope of the planned operation was staggering, involving fake federal inspectors, fraudulent compliance requirements, and a timeline designed to extract maximum money before anyone could verify the legitimacy of their claims. My grandfather and I decided to be proactive rather than reactive for the first time in this entire nightmare. "We're not going to sit here and wait for Karen to destroy another community," Grandpa declared as we spread maps of the Golden Years area across my kitchen table. "We're going to set a trap that will expose her interior operation in a way that can't be covered up or explained away." Our plan was elegant in its simplicity. We would create a fake valuable cabin scenario that would be too tempting for Karen to resist, while simultaneously documenting for law enforcement. I would spread rumors through carefully chosen channels about my cabin containing a rare antique collection worth over $500,000, inherited from my great service. The bait would be irresistible to someone who specialized in targeting valuable rural properties. Setting up our trap required more technical expertise than I'd expected, but Bob Thompson walked us through the process of installing hidden cameras and recording equipment that could capture both audio and video evidence of Karen's illegal activities. "The key is making sure everything we collect will be admissible in court," Bob explained as he helped me position cameras throughout the cabin. "We need clear documentation of her making fraudulent claims, threatening illegal consequences, and demanding money under pretenses." Deputy Rodriguez provided us with the legal framework we needed to ensure our evidence collections stayed within constitutional boundaries, while Maria Santos used her journalism background to help us plan questions that would get Karen to incriminate herself on camera. But Karen wasn't going to make this easy for us, and she proved that by escalating her threats against me in ways that made it clear she knew we were investigating her operation. The first sign of serious trouble came when I found photos of my cabin slipped under my front door, images that had been taken with a telephoto lens from somewhere in the surrounding forest. Written on the back of each photo was a simple message: "Fire spreads quickly in dry mountain conditions." The implication was crystal clear, and it represented a significant escalation from financial threats to physical intimidation that made my blood run cold. Richard Blackwood followed up with fake legal documents threatening to sue me into bankruptcy for what he called malicious interference with legitimate business operations, complete with case numbers and court dates that looked authentic enough to fool most people. The most disturbing aspect of Karen's retaliation campaign was how much personal information she'd managed to gather about my family and my life. She somehow had my mother's work address in Denver, my college roommate's phone number, and detailed information about my student loan payments that should have been completely private. This level of information gathering suggests she has access to identity theft resources. Deputy Rodriguez warned us during one of our planning meetings: she's either working with people who have access to credit reporting systems, or she's paying for black market personal information that's been stolen from legitimate databases. The possibility that Karen was connected to organized crime networks rather than just running a simple confidence game changed everything about how we needed to approach our investigation. During a particularly heated phone confrontation, Karen made a critical mistake by revealing too much about her motivations for targeting communities like ours. "You have no idea what it's like to lose everything because of fake community standards," she screamed into the phone during what was supposed to be a negotiation call about my flag violations 20 years ago. "I was where you are now, fighting against people who claim to have authority over my property. The difference is that I lost my house, my savings, and my faith in the system. Now I make sure other people understand what that feels like." Her revelation that she had once been a victim of a real HOA scam added a tragic dimension to her criminal activities, but it also made her more dangerous because she genuinely believed she was justified in her actions. The network we uncovered was far more sophisticated than any of us had initially realized, involving not just Karen and Richard, but also corrupt county officials, fake inspectors, and what appeared to be connections to money-laundering operations that used fake HOA fees to clean proceeds from other criminal activities. "We're not just dealing with a traveling con artist anymore," Grandpa observed as we reviewed the evidence Bob had collected. "This is an organized criminal enterprise that's been operating across multiple states for nearly 2 decades. The realization that we were up against something much bigger than a single scammer was both intimidating and motivating, because it meant that stopping Karen could potentially help dozens of other communities that were being targeted by similar operations. Karen had seriously underestimated my grandfather. She thought she was dealing with an old man and a timid programmer who would cave under pressure. What she didn't know was that this cabin had become a carefully orchestrated trap, and William Morrison had spent 15 years planning for exactly this moment. The confrontation was scheduled for 2 p.m. on a crisp October afternoon, and everything we'd worked for over the past month was about to come to a head. Maria Santos was positioned half a mile away with professional live streaming equipment, ready to broadcast whatever happened to a carefully curated audience of law enforcement officials, journalists, and victim advocacy groups. Bob Thompson had activated our hidden camera system and was monitoring everything from his remote location, while Deputy Rodriguez and his FBI contacts were standing by just out of sight, waiting for our signal. Karen arrived exactly on time, which told me everything I needed to know about how confident she was in her ability to intimidate us into compliance. Her black SUV pulled into my driveway, followed by a second vehicle carrying Richard Blackwood and the fake Inspector Martinez, along with 2 additional men who looked like they'd been hired specifically to provide physical intimidation. Karen stepped out of her vehicle wearing the same professional black suit she'd worn during our first encounter, but this time she was carrying what appeared to be an official court order in a leather portfolio. "Mr. Morrison," she called out as she approached my front porch, her voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from years of successful bullying. "I have a legally binding court order that grants me immediate access to this property to conduct a comprehensive or complete inspection." She held up the document like it was some kind of magical talisman that would automatically grant her whatever she wanted, and I had to admit that it looked completely legitimate to the untrained eye. "This order was issued by the Federal Housing Compliance Division in conjunction with the Regional Environmental Protection Authority," she continued, reading from what was obviously a carefully prepared script. "Failure to comply with this inspection will result in immediate federal intervention and potential criminal charges for obstruction of official duties." Richard Blackwood stepped forward at this point, adding his layer of legal intimidation to the proceedings. "Mr. Morrison, I strongly advise you to cooperate fully with this inspection," he said in the kind of pompous tone that only disbarred lawyers can truly master. "Resistance to federal authority carries serious consequences that could affect not only your property rights but also your freedom." My grandfather chose that moment to open the front door, and I watched Karen's confident expression falter slightly as she found herself face-to-face with someone who wasn't intimidated by her. "Welcome, Karen," Grandpa said with the kind of calm authority that comes from decades of dealing with criminals and con artists. "I've been waiting 15 years for this moment." Something in his tone must have triggered alarm bells in Karen's head, because she hesitated for the first time since I'd known her. But her greed and arrogance won out over her survival instincts, and she stepped forward toward the cabin entrance. "Sir, I don't know who you think you are, but this is official federal business, and you need to step aside immediately," she'd mumbled, waving her fake court order like she was casting a spell. That's when my grandfather made his move with kind of swift precision that reminded me he'd spent 30 years in law enforcement. As soon as Karen stepped onto the porch and crossed the threshold of our property, Grandpa grabbed her wrist and spun her around with a move that would have made a martial arts instructor proud. Before she could react or call for help, he had her hands behind her back and was applying a pair of genuine police handcuffs that he'd kept from his detective days. "Karen Blackwood, you're under arrest for fraud, extortion, and criminal trespass," he announced in his official polished voice while she struggled futilely against the restraints. "You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you exercise that right immediately." The clicking sound of those handcuffs snapping shut was the most satisfying noise I'd ever heard in my life, and it marked the exact moment when Karen's 15-year crime spree finale came to an end. Bob Thompson activated our hidden camera system at precisely the right moment, broadcasting Karen's shocked and furious reaction to thousands of viewers who were watching the live stream in real time. "This is illegal," she screamed, her professional composure completely shattered as she realized she'd walked directly into "You can't arrest me, I have federal authority. This is kidnapping." But her protests only made her look more guilty as the cameras captured every word of her increasingly desperate yells and threats. Richard Blackwood made the mistake of trying to run when he saw what was happening to his partner, but he didn't get very far before Deputy Rodriguez and 2 FBI agents emerged from their concealment zones and tackled him in my driveway. Martinez, the fake inspector, surprised everyone by immediately eulogising and asking to speak to law enforcement about making a deal in exchange for his cooperation. "I want immunity," he shouted, as the FBI agents secured the scene. "I can give you evidence about the whole operation. Bank accounts, victim lists, everything you need to shut this down permanently." The 2 hired musclemen took one look at the federal badges and decided that discretion was the better part of valor, dropping to their knees with their hands behind their heads before anyone even asked them to. The live stream exploded across social media platforms faster than we'd ever expected, with the hashtag #Grandpa Handcuffs Karen trending nationally within hours of the confrontation. Local news stations picked up the story immediately, and by evening we were fielding interview requests from major networks that wanted to cover the story of the rural community that had stood up to organized "Proud Karen 15 years ago. You escaped justice because I didn't have enough evidence to stop you," my grandfather said as the FBI agents prepared to transport her to federal custody. "But today, Justice has finally come home. The look of absolute defeat on Karen's face was worth every moment of stress and fear she'd put us through, and Ike knew that this was a moment I'd remember for the rest of my life. $4.7 million that was. The total amount Karen's network had stolen from over 200 families during their 8-year organized crime spree across multiple states. But the courthouse drama that followed our cabin confrontation was just the beginning of a much larger story about justice, community, and the power of standing up to corruption. 2 months after Karen's arrest, the federal courthouse in Denver became the stage for one of the most watched fraud trials in Colorado history, with victims traveling from 8 different states to see their tormentor finally face consequences for her crimes. The prosecution had built an airtight case using our recorded evidence, Bob Thompson's digital forensics, and testimony from dozens of victims who had been waiting years for their chance to tell their stories in a court of law. Karen's defense strategy was as predictable as it was desperate, with a new attorney attempting to portray her as a victim of childhood trauma and claiming she suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder related to her own experience with HOA fraud 20 years earlier. My client was manipulated by sophisticated criminals who took advantage of her psychological vulnerabilities, her lawyer argued during opening statements, trying to paint Karen as another victim rather than the mastermind of a multi-state criminal enterprise. Richard Blackwood threw Karen completely under the bus, claiming he'd been manipulated and coerced into participating in fraudulent activities that he'd never fully understood. County Clerk Johnson had already accepted a plea bargain in exchange for exposing the entire corruption network, providing prosecutors with detailed evidence about how they'd created fake HOA registrations and manipulated official databases to legitimize their scams. My grandfather and I were called as key witnesses during the 3rd week of the trial, and I'll never forget the moment when the prosecution played our cabin confrontation video for the jury. Karen's calculated behavior, her professional threats, and her complete lack of remorse were captured in high definition for everyone to see, destroying her insanity defense and exposing the sophisticated nature of her criminal operation. This is not the behavior of someone suffering from mental illness, the prosecutor explained to the jury as they watched Karen demand entry to our cabin with fake federal documents. This is the behavior of a career criminal who has perfected her methods through years of practice and has no intention of stopping until she's forced to stop. The 15 years of evidence my grandfather had painstakingly collected provided the historical context that proved Karen's crimes were part of a long-term pattern rather than isolated incidents. Death sentences exceeded even our most optimistic expectations and sent a clear message that elder fraud would be prosecuted to the fullest extent of federal law. Karen received 12 years in federal prison plus $2 million in restitution payments, ensuring she'd spend her remaining productive years behind bars while her victims recovered their stolen money. Richard was sentenced to 8 years with permanent discipline and a $1 million fine, effectively ending any possibility of him practicing law or participating in similar schemes in the future. Johnson received 4 years in federal prison plus immediate termination from his county position with his pension fund to help pay victim restitution. Martinez, who had cooperated fully with the investigation, received 2 years of probation and community service, along with a requirement to testify in related case involving the broader criminal network. The transformation of Golden Years community into a model for senior protection became one of the most inspiring outcomes of our entire ordeal. The residents established what they called the Morrison Protocol, a comprehensive system for verifying the legitimacy of any organization claiming authority over their properties. "We're never going to be victimized again," declared Grandma Betty, the 85-year-old former union organizer, who had emerged as the community's unofficial leader during the crisis. "Every resident now knows how to check county records, verify official documents, and contact law enforcement if anything seems suspicious." The community also established a mutual aid network that ensured no resident would face financial pressure alone, creating a support system that extended far beyond HOA fraud prevention. I used my programming skills to create verifymyhoa.org, or a free website that helps seniors and rural property owners check the legitimacy of any organization claiming homeowners association authority over their land. The site includes searchable databases of legitimate HOAs, step-by-step guides for verifying official documents, and direct links to county offices where residents can confirm property regulations. Within 6 months of launching, the website had helped over 50,000 people verify HOA claims, and we documented attempts by fake organizations to scam residents in 12 different states. Maria Santos wrote a Pulitzer Prize-nominated investigative about elder fraud that led to national legislation strengthening penalties for crimes targeting senior communities. The cabin that had started this entire adventure became something much more meaningful than just my remote work location. Emily Rodriguez, who coordinated volunteer programs at Golden Years Community, became not just my girlfriend but my partner in expanding our elder protection work throughout Colorado. We converted part of the cabin property into what we called The Elder Justice Retreat, a training center where seniors could learn about financial fraud prevention, legal rights, and community organizing. The annual Morrison Day celebration brought together fraud victims, law enforcement officials, and community organizers from across the region to share resources and strategies for protecting vulnerable populations. 1 year after the trial, my grandfather married Grandma Betty in a ceremony held right here at the cabin with over 300 guests celebrating not just their union but the power of community action to defeat corruption and protect the vulnerable. The wedding reception featured testimonials from fraud victims whose lives had been restored, law enforcement officials who'd learned new strategies for investigating elder fraud, and community organizers who'd been inspired by our story to start their protection programs. Sometimes justice isn't about revenge, Grandpa said during his wedding toast, looking out at the crowd of people whose lives had been changed by our fight against Karen's criminal network. It's about protection, community, and making sure that what happened to us never happens to anyone else. The American flag still flees from our cabin porch, joined now by a premier flag honoring my grandfather and all veterans who never stop fighting for what's right. Because some battles are worth the wait, and some victorious belong to entire communities rather than individual heroes. Have you ever felt powerless against someone abusing their authority like Karen? Bullies rely on intimidation and fake credentials to silence good people. But Jake and his grandfather proved that standing together, gathering evidence, and refusing to back down can defeat even the most